The thermometer outside Dmitry Volkov's cabin read 58 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes, yet he descended through the trapdoor in his cabin floor and walked underground to his smokehouse without a coat. Above ground, his neighbors huddled in their cabins, watching their winter meat supplies freeze solid in smokehouses they couldn't reach, fires dying in structures that might as well have been on the moon. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story involves an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. The winter of 1863 arrived early in the northern Dakota Territory, bringing with it the kind of cold that made men question their decision to settle so far from civilization. Dmitry Volkov stood outside his cabin in late November, splitting wood as the temperature hovered near 20 below zero. His breath formed clouds that hung in the still air before dissipating. The sky was that particular shade of pale blue that meant colder weather was coming. He had learned to read these signs during his 3 years in the territory. His nearest neighbor, Abram Lebedev, lived a quarter mile to the east. Beyond Abram were the Orlov family, then the Sokolovs, then a scattering of other homesteads stretched across the valley. They were all Russian immigrants, drawn to this harsh land by the promise of free property under the Homestead Act. Most had arrived within the past 5 years. They helped each other during harvest, shared news and supplies, and gathered for Orthodox Christmas celebrations in Mikhail Orlov's larger cabin. But each family ultimately survived or failed based on their own preparation and luck. Dmitry's cabin was small but well built. He had constructed it during his first summer in the territory, using techniques he had learned in Russia, combined with methods he observed from other settlers. The walls were thick logs, chinked with clay and moss. The roof was sod over birch bark over split planks. A stone fireplace occupied one corner. The single room measured 16 feet by 20 feet. It was cramped, but it was warm, and it was his. Behind the cabin, 30 yards away, stood his smokehouse. It was a smaller structure, perhaps 8 feet square, with a low roof and a small door. Inside, racks held the preserved meat that would sustain him through the winter. Venison from 2 deer he had shot in October. Elk meat from a successful hunt he had shared with Pyotr Sokolov. Strips of bear meat from an animal he had trapped in September. The smokehouse fire burned constantly during preservation season, creating the steady smoke that prevented spoilage and added flavor. Once properly smoked, the meat would last for months if kept cold and dry. This system of meat preservation was not unique to Dmitry. Every homesteader in the territory used similar methods. You hunted or slaughtered in autumn. You smoked the meat. You stored it in a separate structure where the cold would keep it frozen through winter. Come spring, you hoped you had preserved enough to last until fresh food became available again. It was a cycle as old as human settlement in cold climates. Pyotr Sokolov's homestead lay 2 miles northwest of Dmitry's cabin. Pyotr had arrived in the territory the same year as Dmitry. They had worked together on several occasions, helping each other with construction projects and sharing hunting territory. Pyotr was younger, perhaps 25 to Dmitry's 32, and more optimistic about frontier life. He talked about bringing a wife from Russia once he had established himself. He planned to expand his homestead, add cattle, maybe even build a proper barn within a few years. Dmitry listened to these plans without comment. He had learned that the frontier had a way of teaching humility to those who made too many assumptions about the future. The cold that arrived in mid-January 1863 was different from normal winter weather. Dmitry noticed it first in how the air felt against his face when he stepped outside. It wasn't just cold, it had a sharp, biting quality that seemed to penetrate through layers of clothing immediately. The thermometer he had mounted outside his cabin door read 38 below zero on the morning of January 14th. By afternoon, it had dropped to 42 below. Pyotr Sokolov had visited Dmitry's cabin 3 days earlier. They had shared coffee and discussed the approaching weather. Both men had experienced Russian winters, but this Dakota cold was different. It was drier, more penetrating. Pyotr mentioned that his smokehouse fire had been difficult to maintain. The extreme cold made the wood burn faster, and the wind kept finding ways through gaps in the structure. Dmitri had experienced similar challenges. They agreed to check on each other if the weather worsened. On January 16th, the temperature dropped to 47 below zero. The sky was clear, which meant no insulating cloud cover. Dmitri made 2 trips to his smokehouse that day, each time moving quickly despite the heavy coat and fur hat he wore. The 30-yard walk felt dangerous. His lungs ached from breathing the frigid air. His exposed cheeks began to numb within seconds. He added wood to the fire, checked the meat hanging from the racks, and hurried back to his cabin. That night the wind arrived. It came from the northwest, steady and brutal. Dmitri lay in his bunk listening to it howl around his cabin. He thought about his smokehouse. The wind would be driving cold air through every gap in the structure. The fire would struggle. He considered going out to check it, but decided against it. The risk was too great in darkness. Morning brought worse conditions. The thermometer read 51 below zero. The wind continued. Dmitri knew he needed to reach his smokehouse, but he also knew the danger. He dressed in every layer he owned, 2 pairs of wool pants, 3 shirts, his heaviest coat, wool scarf wrapped around his face, fur hat pulled low, heavy mittens. He opened his cabin door and stepped into conditions that felt like walking into a physical force trying to push him back inside. He made it to the smokehouse. The fire was nearly out. He added wood, worked the embers back to flame, and returned to his cabin. The entire process took perhaps 15 minutes. When he removed his scarf, his beard had frozen solid. His fingers were numb despite the mittens. He spent an hour by his fireplace recovering. Pyotr Sokolov attempted the same journey that afternoon. His smokehouse was farther from his cabin than Dmitri's, perhaps 50 yards. Pyotr made it halfway. A neighbor found his body the next morning when the wind finally stopped. He had frozen to death trying to save his winter meat supply. The smokehouse fire had died. Everything inside would spoil. The ground was frozen too hard to dig in January, so Pyotr Sokolov's body was stored in Mikhail Orlov's root cellar until spring. When April finally brought a thaw, 6 men spent a full day breaking through the softening earth on a hillside overlooking Pyotr's abandoned homestead. Dmitri was among them. They buried Pyotr on a gray afternoon with cold rain falling. Father Alexander, an itinerant Orthodox priest who traveled between scattered Russian settlements, spoke prayers in Church Slavonic. The words were familiar to Dmitri, but they felt hollow. Prayer hadn't saved Pyotr. Prayer wouldn't save the next man who faced similar circumstances. After the funeral, the community gathered at Mikhail Orlov's cabin. It was the largest structure in the area, capable of holding 20 people if they packed in closely. Wives had prepared food. Men passed around a bottle of vodka Abram Lebedev had been saving. Conversation inevitably turned to the brutal winter they had survived. Abram mentioned that he had lost half his meat supply. His smokehouse fire had gone out during the worst cold. By the time weather permitted him to reach it again, spoilage had begun. He had salvaged what he could, but his family had faced hungry weeks in late winter. The Orlov family had experienced similar losses. Henrik Korhonen, a Finnish settler who lived at the edge of the Russian community, said he had nearly frozen his hands trying to maintain his smokehouse during the cold snap. His wife had forbidden him from making additional trips. They too had lost meat. Dmitri listened to these accounts. A pattern emerged. Everyone had faced the same problem. Smokehouses required regular attention. Fires needed wood. Meat needed monitoring. But during extreme cold, accessing structures even 30 or 40 yards from the main cabin became life-threatening. You either risked freezing to death, or you let your meat supply spoil. Those were the only options, and both options were failures. The homesteaders accepted this as simply how frontier life worked. You did your best. Sometimes you lost part of your food supply. Sometimes you lost your life. It was the price of settling in a harsh environment. But Dmitri couldn't accept this reasoning. Pyotr hadn't died because of bad luck or insufficient preparation. He had died because of a design problem. The system itself was flawed. That night, lying in his bunk, Dmitri thought about distance: 30 yards, 50 yards. These were trivial distances in normal conditions. A man could walk 50 yards in seconds. But in 50 below zero, weather with wind, 50 yards became an impossible gulf. The problem wasn't the cold itself. The problem was exposure to the cold during necessary tasks. He thought about his years working in the Ural Mountain silver mines before immigrating to America. Miners descended hundreds of feet underground through vertical shafts. They worked in tunnels that extended horizontally through rock. Surface weather didn't matter. A blizzard could be raging above, while miners worked in stable conditions below. The temperature underground remained relatively constant regardless of season. Dmitri had worked in the Ural Mountain mines for 4 years before leaving Russia. The work was brutal and dangerous, but it had taught him principles that most farmers and homesteaders never learned. Underground environments follow different rules than surface conditions. Temperature, airflow, structural stability, all of these factors behaved in ways that seemed counterintuitive until you understood the principles. The silver mine where Dmitri had worked descended 300 feet below the surface. The main shaft was vertical with ladder access and a rope pulley system for hauling ore. From the bottom of the main shaft, horizontal tunnels extended in multiple directions following silver veins through the rock. Some tunnels ran for hundreds of yards. Men spent entire shifts underground, only surfacing at the end of their work period. What Dmitri remembered most clearly was the temperature. Surface conditions in the Urals varied dramatically. Summer could bring heat into the 80s. Winter regularly dropped to 20 or 30 below zero. But underground, the temperature remained steady. In winter, the mines felt warm compared to the surface. In summer, they felt cool. The rock itself maintained a constant temperature that reflected neither the extreme heat nor extreme cold above. The mine engineers explained this to new workers. Below the frost line, which in the Urals was approximately 4 feet deep, the earth maintained a relatively stable temperature year-round. The deeper you went, the more stable it became. At 300 feet, seasonal variations were completely eliminated. The temperature stayed near 50 degrees regardless of whether it was January or July above ground. This principle had practical applications in the mines. Tunnels didn't require heating in winter or cooling in summer. Ventilation was necessary to provide fresh air and remove gas from blasting, but temperature control was never a concern. The earth itself provided insulation from surface extremes. Dmitri had also learned about tunnel construction. The horizontal passages through rock required careful engineering. They needed support beams to prevent collapse. They needed proper drainage to handle water seepage. They needed adequate dimensions to allow men and equipment to pass. But once properly constructed, tunnels were remarkably durable. Some passages in the mine where Dmitri worked had been in use for over 30 years. Lying in his cabin in Dakota territory, these memories took on new significance. What if the principle of underground stability could be applied to frontier homesteading? What if there was a way to access a smokehouse without exposing yourself to surface weather? The idea seemed absurd at first. Digging a tunnel through Dakota soil was not the same as mining through Ural rock. The distances were different. The purposes were different. But the fundamental principle remained valid. Underground passages eliminated exposure to surface weather while maintaining stable temperature conditions. Dmitri began thinking through the practicalities. His smokehouse was 30 yards from his cabin. In mining terms, that was nothing. A tunnel of 30 yards was trivial compared to the hundreds of yards he had worked in the Urals. The depth required would be minimal. He wouldn't need to go below the frost line for structural reasons, just deep enough to create a protected passage. Spring arrived slowly in the Dakota Territory. By late April 1864, the ground had thawed enough to work. Dmitri spent the first weeks of spring planting a small garden and repairing winter damage to his cabin and outbuildings. But his mind remained focused on the tunnel concept. During evening hours, he sketched plans using charcoal on pieces of bark. He calculated distances, estimated the amount of earth he would need to move, and considered structural requirements. The tunnel would need to start inside his cabin. This made sense for multiple reasons. An interior entrance meant he could access the tunnel without first exposing himself to outdoor weather. It also meant the entrance would be protected and secure. He selected a location near the back wall of his cabin, opposite the fireplace. The floor in that area was packed earth. He could dig down, create an entrance, and install a trapdoor that would be invisible to casual observers. From the entrance, the tunnel would descend at a gentle angle for approximately 6 feet, reaching a depth of 4 feet below the surface. Then, it would level off and run horizontally for 30 yards, ending directly beneath his smokehouse. At the smokehouse end, the tunnel would rise back to the surface, creating an entrance inside the smokehouse structure itself. The dimensions required careful consideration. The tunnel needed to be wide enough for a man to walk through while carrying wood or other supplies. Too narrow would make it impractical. Too wide would require unnecessary excavation. Dmitri settled on a width of 3 feet and a height of 6 feet. This would allow him to move through it comfortably while minimizing the amount of earth he needed to remove. Support structures presented the main engineering challenge. A tunnel through soft earth required shoring to prevent collapse. In the mines, this had been accomplished using timber frames installed every few feet along the tunnel length. Each frame consisted of vertical posts on either side and a horizontal beam across the top. The frames supported planks or boards along the walls and ceiling, which in turn held back the earth. Dmitri had timber available. The surrounding area had sufficient trees. He would need to cut, haul, and mill the lumber himself, but this was manageable. The real question was whether the simple frame technique used in rock mines would work in soft prairie soil. Rock provided inherent stability. Soil was prone to shifting and collapse. In late May, Dmitri rode to the nearest settlement with a general store, a distance of 18 miles. He purchased basic supplies and mentioned his tunnel plan to the store owner, expecting skepticism. The man laughed and suggested Dmitri had spent too much time alone over winter. On the return journey, Dmitri stopped at Abram Lebedev's homestead. Abram was working on his own smokehouse, replacing boards that had warped over winter. Dmitri explained his tunnel concept, describing how it would provide protected access during severe weather. Abram listened politely, then shook his head. He asked why Dmitri didn't simply build his smokehouse closer to his cabin. The tunnel seemed like an enormous amount of work to solve a problem that occurred maybe once or twice per winter. Dmitri tried to explain the principle of eliminating exposure entirely, but Abram remained unconvinced. As Dmitri rode away, he heard Abram laughing. June brought warm weather and long daylight hours. Dmitri began excavation on the 4th day of the month. He started inside his cabin, marking a rectangle on the earthen floor, measuring 4 feet by 5 feet. This would be the entrance shaft. He used a shovel to break through the packed surface, then began removing earth one shovelful at a time. The soil was dense clay mixed with rocks and roots. Each shovel load required effort. Dmitri worked in the early morning and late evening when temperatures were cooler. Midday heat made the work unbearable. He hauled the excavated earth outside in a wooden bucket, dumping it in a growing pile behind his cabin. After 3 days, he had dug down 4 feet, creating a rectangular pit. The next phase involved beginning the horizontal tunnel. From the bottom of the entrance shaft, Dmitri started digging toward the smokehouse. He worked on his knees using a shorter-handled spade, designed for confined spaces. A coal oil lamp provided light. The air was stale, and breathing became difficult after an hour of work. He developed a rhythm. Dig for an hour, surface for fresh air and water, descend again. Progress was measured in inches. On a good day, Dmitri could extend the tunnel forward by 3 feet. Most days yielded less. The excavated earth had to be hauled back to the entrance shaft, lifted to the surface in buckets, then carried outside. For every foot of tunnel advanced, Dmitri moved approximately 12 cubic feet of earth through this laborious process. By late June, the tunnel extended 15 feet from the entrance shaft. Dmitri began installing support frames. He had cut timber from nearby trees, shaping posts and beams using an axe and saw. Each frame required 2 vertical posts sunk into the tunnel floor and a horizontal beam spanning the top. The frames were spaced 3 feet apart. Between frames, Dmitri installed horizontal boards along the walls and ceiling, creating a wooden lining that held back the earth. The shoring process was slow but necessary. Dmitri had witnessed tunnel collapses in the Urals. Men had died buried under tons of rock. Prairie soil was less stable than rock. Without proper support, the tunnel would collapse. He worked carefully, checking each frame for stability before proceeding. Abram Lebedev visited in early July. He found Dmitri emerging from the tunnel entrance, covered in dirt and sweat. Abram peered down into the shaft, shook his head, and commented that Dmitri was digging his own grave. He asked how long this project would take. Dmitri estimated another 2 months. Abram laughed again and said he could build 3 smokehouses in that time. Why not just accept that winter sometimes meant staying inside and letting the fire die? Dmitri didn't respond. He had learned that some people couldn't envision solutions beyond their existing experience. Other neighbors began stopping by out of curiosity. Mikhail Orlov brought his 2 sons to see the excavation. The boys found it fascinating. Mikhail asked technical questions about the support frames and ventilation. He didn't mock the project, but he also didn't offer to help. Everyone had their own work to complete before winter returned. July brought heat that made underground work almost preferable to surface labor. The tunnel remained cool even as the prairie baked under relentless sun. Dmitri continued excavating, advancing slowly toward his goal. By mid-July, the tunnel extended 25 feet. 5 feet remained until he would reach the point directly beneath his smokehouse. The physical toll was substantial. Dmitri's hands developed calluses on top of existing calluses. His back ached from working in a bent position for hours daily. He lost weight despite eating as much as his supplies allowed. Every evening he emerged from the tunnel exhausted, barely able to prepare a simple meal before collapsing into sleep. Ventilation became a serious concern as the tunnel lengthened. The air at the working face grew increasingly stale. Dmitri's coal oil lamp would begin to flicker and dim, indicating insufficient oxygen. He solved this by creating a simple ventilation system. He cut a small hole through the roof of his cabin, installed a pipe that extended down into the entrance shaft, and covered the top with a cowl that prevented rain entry while allowing airflow. The system worked adequately, though conditions at the tunnel face remained uncomfortable. The support frame installation continued. By late July, Dmitri had installed 8 complete frames spanning 24 feet of tunnel. Each frame represented a full day's work, cutting and shaping timber, hauling it into the tunnel, positioning the posts, lifting the heavy crossbeam into place, and securing everything with wooden pegs and iron brackets he had purchased during his supply trip. Abram Lebedev brought other settlers to see Volkov's mine to nowhere in early August. 4 men stood around the entrance shaft, peering down into darkness. One asked what Dmitri planned to do with a tunnel that went nowhere. Dmitri explained that it would eventually connect to his smokehouse, creating protected access during winter. The men exchanged glances. One commented that next Dmitri would probably dig a tunnel to the creek so he wouldn't have to walk for water. They all laughed. Abram said the effort might make sense if Dmitri was mining gold, but for accessing a smokehouse? It was madness. Dmitri ignored the mockery. He had faced skepticism before when suggesting improvements to mining techniques in the Urals. Supervisors had dismissed his ideas until they saw them work. He understood that people resisted unfamiliar concepts especially when those concepts required significant effort. By mid-August, the horizontal tunnel reached the point beneath his smokehouse. Now came the second vertical shaft. Dmitri began digging upward, creating a shaft that would rise from the tunnel level to the interior of his smokehouse above. This was more challenging than the entrance shaft. The excavated earth fell down rather than being lifted up. He developed a technique using buckets on ropes, pulling earth down into the horizontal tunnel, then hauling it back to the entrance. The upward shaft broke through into his smokehouse on September 3rd. Dmitri heard the shovel break through the final layer of packed earth, then saw sunlight filtering down from above. He climbed up into the smokehouse and examined the opening. It measured 3 feet by 3 feet, positioned in the corner where it wouldn't interfere with the meat racks or fire pit. The exit required finishing work. The edges of the opening were rough and unstable. Earth crumbled when touched. Dmitri spent 2 days lining the shaft with timber, creating a wooden frame that extended from the tunnel below up through the smokehouse floor. He built a trapdoor from heavy planks hinged to open downward into the tunnel. When closed, the door would sit flush with the smokehouse floor. The tunnel itself needed improvements. The earthen floor was uneven and muddy in places where groundwater seeped through. Dmitri began laying a floor using flat stones he gathered from a creek bed half a mile away. Each stone had to be hauled to his cabin, carried down into the entrance shaft, and moved through the tunnel to its final position. The process took weeks. By late September, he had created a stable walking surface that eliminated the mud problem. Ventilation in the smokehouse chamber required special attention. The tunnel would allow air movement between the cabin and smokehouse, but the smokehouse itself needed proper draft for the fire. Dmitri had always relied on gaps in the walls and a simple opening in the roof. Now, with an underground entrance, he needed a more sophisticated system. He rebuilt the smokehouse's existing ventilation, installing a properly designed chimney that extended 5 feet above the roofline. The chimney was stone, mortared carefully to prevent smoke leakage. Inside the smokehouse, he created a stone firebox raised slightly off the floor. This elevated position allowed better airflow and reduced the chance of the tunnel filling with smoke. The smoke management required careful engineering. Dmitri wanted smoke to circulate around the meat racks, then exit through the chimney. He didn't want smoke pouring down into the tunnel. He solved this by installing a stone barrier at the base of the exit shaft. The barrier was 18 inches high, creating a threshold that smoke would have to rise over before entering the tunnel. In practice, the natural draft created by the chimney pulled smoke upward rather than allowing it to sink into the tunnel. By early October, the basic tunnel system was complete. Dmitri could enter through the trapdoor in his cabin floor, descend into the entrance shaft, walk through 30 feet of timber-supported tunnel, and emerge through the trapdoor in his smokehouse. The entire journey took less than 2 minutes and involved no exposure to outdoor weather. But Dmitri wasn't finished. The tunnel had revealed additional possibilities. The stable underground temperature suggested other uses beyond simple access. He began excavating a side chamber off the main tunnel, midway between cabin and smokehouse. This chamber would serve as a root cellar for storing vegetables through winter. The root cellar chamber took an additional 3 weeks to complete. Dmitri excavated a space measuring 8 feet by 10 feet, accessed through an opening in the main tunnel wall. The ceiling height was 6 feet, allowing him to stand upright. He lined the walls with timber shoring similar to the tunnel itself, installed wooden shelving along 3 walls, and created a stone floor for drainage and stability. The underground temperature in this chamber remained remarkably constant. Dmitri had installed a thermometer and monitored it daily through late September and early October. Surface temperatures varied from highs in the 60s during afternoon to lows in the 30s at night. The root cellar stayed between 48 and 52 degrees regardless of surface conditions. This was ideal for storing root vegetables, preserving them without freezing, while keeping them cool enough to prevent spoilage. October brought the first hard frost. Dmitri harvested his garden, storing potatoes, carrots, turnips, and beets in the root cellar chamber. He also used the space for storing smoked meat that had already been prepared, creating additional capacity beyond his smokehouse racks. The system worked perfectly. He could access all his food stores without stepping outside his cabin. The total investment in the project was staggering by frontier standards. Dmitri had spent the entire growing season focused primarily on excavation and construction. His garden was smaller than previous years. He had spent little time on other improvements to his homestead. Every moment of daylight from June through October had been devoted to the tunnel system. The materials cost was also significant. Timber for the support frames required cutting and hauling dozens of trees. Stone for the floors and fireplace meant countless trips to the creek. Iron brackets, nails, hinges for the trapdoors, and other hardware had cost him a substantial portion of his saved money. A neighbor calculating pure economics would conclude the project was wasteful. Abram Lebedev visited in late October as Dmitri was finishing the final details. The first snow had fallen 2 days earlier, a light dusting that melted by afternoon. Winter was approaching. Abram examined the completed system, descending into the tunnel and walking through to the smokehouse. He emerged, shaking his head. Abram admitted the construction was impressive. The tunnel was well built and functional, but he questioned whether it was worth the effort. He calculated that Dmitri had invested approximately 4 months of labor. In that time, Abram had expanded his own cabin, built a new shed, and completed various other projects. The tunnel solved one problem: access during extreme weather, but extreme weather only occurred occasionally. Most winters involved many days when accessing a separate smokehouse was perfectly safe. Dmitri listened without arguing. He understood Abram's perspective. The tunnel was insurance against events that might not occur, but Pyotr Sokolov had died during one of those rare events. The tunnel wasn't just about convenience. It was about eliminating a specific risk that Dmitri had witnessed kill a man. November 1864 brought typical early winter conditions to the Dakota Territory. Temperatures dropped into the 20s at night, rose to the 30s during the day. Light snow fell intermittently, accumulating to a depth of several inches. Dmitri began his winter routine, processing game and smoking meat for long-term storage. The tunnel immediately proved its practical value. Multiple times each day, Dmitri descended through the trapdoor in his cabin, walked through the underground passage, and emerged in his smokehouse. He added wood to the fire, rotated meat on the drying racks, checked temperature and smoke levels, and returned to his cabin. Each trip took minutes and required no preparation beyond lighting a candle to carry through the tunnel. The contrast with his previous winter routine was striking. Before the tunnel, every smokehouse visit required dressing in outdoor clothing, bracing for cold, walking 30 yards through whatever weather existed, completing tasks with numbed fingers, and returning. Even in moderate cold, this was unpleasant. In severe cold, it was dangerous. Now he made smokehouse visits in his regular indoor clothing. The underground temperature remained stable as autumn progressed into winter. By late November, surface temperatures regularly dropped below zero. The tunnel stayed near 50 degrees. Dmitri found that he needed no coat or hat for the brief walk through the passage. The temperature was cool, but not uncomfortable for the 2 minutes required to travel from cabin to smokehouse. The root cellar chamber proved equally valuable. Dmitri stored his winter vegetables there, along with preserved meat that had completed the smoking process. He could inventory his supplies, retrieve items for meals, and monitor everything without outdoor exposure. The consistent temperature prevented freezing while keeping everything properly preserved. Mikhail Orlov visited in early December. He was curious about how the tunnel system performed during actual winter conditions. Dmitri gave him a complete tour, descending through the cabin entrance, showing the root cellar chamber, continuing to the smokehouse, and explaining how each element functioned. Mikhail was impressed. He asked detailed questions about the construction process, the support frame design, and the ventilation system. Mikhail mentioned that his own smokehouse was 40 yards from his cabin, farther than Dmitri's had been. During the previous winter's extreme cold, he had made only 2 trips to his smokehouse over a 10-day period. Both trips had been frightening experiences. His fingers had gone numb. His face had been frostbitten. He had nearly decided the risk wasn't worth it. A tunnel would eliminate that danger entirely. But Mikhail also acknowledged the enormous labor investment. He had 5 children and a wife. His time was divided among many responsibilities. Could he realistically spend an entire summer excavating a tunnel? Dmitri understood the concern, but suggested that the labor could be distributed over time. The tunnel didn't need to be completed in a single season. December continued with moderate winter weather. The coldest temperature Dmitri recorded was 18 below zero, cold but old, manageable. The tunnel system worked flawlessly, requiring no repairs or modifications. January 1865 began unremarkably. Temperatures hovered in the teens and 20s, typical for the Dakota winter. Snow fell intermittently, adding to the accumulated depth but never creating drifts that blocked movement. Dmitri maintained his routine, tending his smokehouse through the tunnel, managing his supplies, and preparing for the remainder of winter. On January 20th, the weather changed. The temperature rose into the 40s, unusually warm for late January. Snow began melting, creating muddy conditions around the homesteads. Dmitri noticed the shift immediately. Warm spells in deep winter were common enough, but this one felt different. The air had a peculiar quality, a stillness that seemed unnatural. Abram Lebedev stopped by on January 22nd. He mentioned that several of the older settlers were commenting on the unusual weather pattern. Men who had lived through multiple Dakota winters recognized signs that younger settlers missed. The warm spell, combined with certain atmospheric conditions and the behavior of wildlife, suggested something significant was approaching. The warmth lasted 3 days. Then, on January 24th, the wind shifted to the northwest. The temperature began dropping. By evening, it had fallen from 42 degrees to 18 degrees. By midnight, Dmitri's thermometer read 4 below zero. The drop continued through the night. Morning on January 25th brought clear skies and bitter cold. The thermometer showed 26 below zero at dawn. By afternoon, it had only risen to 22 below. The wind had stopped, leaving an eerie calm. Dmitri stood outside his cabin briefly testing the air. It had that same penetrating quality he remembered from the winter Pyotr died. This wasn't normal cold. This was the beginning of something worse. He spent the afternoon checking his preparations. His cabin had adequate firewood stacked inside. His root cellar held sufficient food. His smokehouse fire was burning steadily, accessible through the tunnel regardless of surface conditions. He filled every container he owned with water from the creek, knowing the trip might become impossible within days. That evening, Dmitri descended into his tunnel and walked to the smokehouse. The underground passage felt warm compared to the surface. He added extra wood to the smokehouse fire, ensuring it would burn strong through the night. He checked the meat on the racks, rotating pieces that needed better smoke exposure. Everything was functioning perfectly. January 26th brought colder temperatures. The thermometer read 38 below zero at dawn. Dmitri made 3 trips through his tunnel that day, maintaining the smokehouse fire and monitoring conditions. Each time he emerged from the cabin entrance, the cold struck him like a physical blow, even during the brief seconds before descending into the tunnel. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 44 below zero. The sky remained clear, stars brilliant against black. No wind moved. The silence was complete except for the occasional crack of trees splitting from the cold. Dmitri knew from experience that this was just the beginning. The real cold was still coming. January 27th brought temperatures that defied comprehension. Dimitri's thermometer showed 51 below zero at dawn. By afternoon, it had dropped further to 54 below. The cold was so intense that simply opening his cabin door to check the thermometer caused a visible wave of frigid air to pour inside, sinking to the floor like water. Dimitri kept his fireplace burning hot, feeding it wood constantly. Even with a strong fire, the cabin's interior temperature struggled to stay above 40 degrees. The walls had frost forming on the inside, where his breath and body heat met the cold, penetrating through the logs. He wore all his clothing in layers even while remaining inside. Through his small window, he could see Abram Lebedev's cabin a quarter-mile away. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight column, indicating the complete absence of wind. This was a mercy. Wind would have made the cold lethal within seconds of exposure. Even without wind, going outside meant risking frostbite and death. Dimitri descended into his tunnel 4 times that day. The passage felt almost warm compared to the surface conditions. His thermometer in the root cellar chamber showed 49 degrees, unchanged from the previous week. The contrast was remarkable. Above ground, temperatures cold enough to kill a man in minutes. Below ground, temperatures that were merely cool. Each trip to the smokehouse was routine. He walked through the tunnel carrying a candle, emerged through the trapdoor into the smokehouse, added wood to the fire, checked the meat, and returned. The entire process took 5 minutes. He never exposed himself to the outdoor cold. Above ground, his neighbors faced a different reality. Through his window late in the afternoon, Dimitri saw a figure emerge from Abram's cabin. The person, heavily bundled in clothing, began walking toward what must have been Abram's smokehouse. The figure moved slowly, struggling against the cold even without wind. Dimitri watched for several minutes. The figure reached a point perhaps 20 yards from the cabin, stopped, seemed to hesitate, then turned back. The retreat was faster than the advance. The person disappeared back into the cabin. That evening, the temperature dropped to 56 below zero. Dimitri had never experienced cold this severe. Even in Russia, winter temperatures rarely reached these extremes. He maintained his cabin fire, ventured into his tunnel twice more to tend the smokehouse, and tried to sleep despite the cold penetrating even his heavy blankets. January 28th was worse. Dawn brought readings of 58 below zero. The sun rose into a pale blue sky, providing light but no warmth. Dimitri kept his window covered with a heavy blanket, knowing that even small openings would allow deadly cold to pour inside. He lived by firelight and candles, descending into his tunnel periodically to maintain his smokehouse fire. The tunnel had become his lifeline. Without it, he would face the same impossible choice his neighbors confronted: risk death to tend the smokehouse or let the fire die and lose the meat. With the tunnel, he maintained perfect smoke and temperature in his smokehouse while never exposing himself to conditions that could kill him. The extreme cold persisted through January 29th and 30th. Dimitri's thermometer never rose above 50 below zero during those 2 days. He settled into a routine dictated by the tunnel system. Every 4 hours, he descended through the trapdoor in his cabin floor and made the journey to his smokehouse. The underground passage remained a constant environment, cool but not cold, dark but easily navigated with a candle, silent except for his footsteps. He had walked this tunnel hundreds of times since its completion, but during the extreme cold it took on new significance. This narrow passage through the earth represented the difference between survival and disaster. The smokehouse fire required careful management. In normal winter conditions, Dimitri could let the fire burn low overnight and rebuild it in the morning, but during the extreme cold, he maintained a steady fire around the clock. The tunnel made this possible. He could check the fire at midnight, at 4 in the morning, at dawn, ensuring constant smoke and heat circulation. The meat on his racks was progressing perfectly. Venison, elk, and smaller game hung in the smoke, gradually transforming from fresh meat into preserved food that would last months. The temperature in the smokehouse stayed ideal, cold enough to prevent spoilage but warm enough to allow the smoking process to continue. Dmitri had lost nothing. Every piece of meat he had harvested that autumn remained intact and properly preserved. From his cabin window, he could see smoke rising from neighboring chimneys. Abram's cabin showed steady smoke, indicating his main fire was maintained. But Dmitri knew that Abram's smokehouse, located behind his cabin and out of sight, likely had no smoke rising from it. The structure was simply too far from Abram's main cabin to reach safely in these conditions. On the afternoon of January 30th, Dmitri saw movement at Mikhail Orlov's homestead, visible in the distance across the snow-covered prairie. A figure emerged from the cabin, stood outside briefly, then retreated back inside. Minutes later, the same figure emerged again, this time moving purposefully toward what must have been Mikhail's smokehouse. Dmitri watched through his window, concerned. The figure made it perhaps 15 yards before stopping. Even at a distance, Dmitri could see the person's body language change. The confident stride became hesitant. The figure stood motionless for what seemed like a full minute, then turned and hurried back to the cabin. The smokehouse remained unreached. Dmitri understood exactly what had happened. Mikhail, or one of his older sons, had attempted to reach their smokehouse to check the fire or add wood. The cold had proven too intense. 15 or 20 yards of exposure was all a person could endure before the risk became unacceptable. The smokehouse was perhaps 40 yards from Mikhail's cabin. That distance had become an impossible gulf. That evening, Dmitri made his regular descent into the tunnel. He carried extra wood for the smokehouse fire, knowing the night would be long and cold. January 30th became January 31st at midnight. Dmitri was awake, tending his cabin fire. He checked his thermometer through the small gap in the blanket covering his window. The mercury had dropped to the bottom of the scale. His thermometer only measured down to 60 below zero. The actual temperature was colder than that. He descended into his tunnel at 2 in the morning. The contrast was immediate and profound. Above ground, cold so extreme it exceeded measurement. Below ground, the same stable temperature that had existed for months. He walked through the passage, emerged in his smokehouse, and found the fire burning steadily. He added wood, checked the meat, and noticed that frost had formed on the inside of the smokehouse walls despite the fire. The cold outside was penetrating even the insulated structure. Back in his cabin by 3 in the morning, Dmitri tried to sleep, but couldn't. The cold was too severe. His fireplace roared with heat, yet the cabin interior remained barely warm enough for survival. He estimated the inside temperature at perhaps 35 degrees despite consuming firewood at an alarming rate. Dawn on January 31st brought no relief. The sun rose into a sky so clear it hurt to look at. The light was brilliant, but provided no warmth. Dmitri's thermometer remained pegged at its lowest reading. He estimated the actual temperature at somewhere between 60 and 65 below zero based on how quickly frost formed on any surface and how the air itself seemed to shimmer with ice crystals. Through his window, he watched Abram's cabin. The chimney smoke was thinner than previous days. This could mean Abram was running low on firewood, or it could mean he was rationing what he had. Either situation was concerning. If Abram ran out of wood, he would need to venture outside to his woodpile. In these temperatures, that simple task could prove fatal. Dmitri made 4 trips through his tunnel that day. Each time, the underground passage felt like a refuge. The stable temperature, the protection from the deadly cold above, the simple ability to walk upright without layers of clothing suffocating him. The tunnel had transformed from an engineering project into a survival tool. By evening, he noticed something alarming at Abram's homestead. The chimney smoke had stopped entirely. Either Abram's fire had gone out or he had run out of wood. Neither possibility was good. A cabin without fire in 60 below zero temperatures would become uninhabitable within hours. Dmitri considered attempting to reach Abram's cabin, but immediately recognized the impossibility. A quarter-mile in these conditions was a death sentence. Night fell. The temperature remained beyond measurement. Dmitri maintained his cabin fire, descended into his tunnel every few hours to tend his smokehouse, and waited for the cold to break. He had adequate supplies. His tunnel system protected his food stores. He could survive weeks if necessary, but he worried about his neighbors who lacked such protection. February 1st brought a shift in conditions. The temperature at dawn was still 48 below zero, brutal but measurable. By afternoon it had risen to 36 below. The extreme cold was breaking. Dmitri maintained his routines while watching the thermometer climb slowly throughout the day. February 2nd showed 28 below at dawn. The sun felt slightly warmer. The air lost that sharp, penetrating quality that had characterized the previous week. By afternoon, the temperature had risen to 18 below. The crisis was ending. On February 3rd, with temperatures in the single digits below zero, Dmitri saw movement at Abram's cabin. A figure emerged, moving slowly, and began walking toward Dmitri's homestead. As the figure approached, Dmitri recognized Abram. He opened his door and waited. Abram looked exhausted. His face showed signs of frostbite on his cheeks and nose. He explained that his smokehouse fire had died on January 30th. He had attempted to reach the structure but couldn't make it the full distance. His family had huddled in their cabin for 3 days, burning every piece of wood they had inside, including furniture, when the firewood ran out. They had survived, but Abram's entire winter meat supply was ruined. Without the fire, the meat in his smokehouse had frozen solid. Then, when temperatures moderated, it began to spoil. He estimated he had lost 70% of his stored meat. His family faced a hungry late winter and spring. Abram asked to see Dmitri's tunnel system. They descended through the trapdoor in the cabin floor. Dmitri carried a lantern, illuminating the timber-shored passage. They walked through to the smokehouse. Abram examined everything silently. The tunnel structure, the root cellar chamber, the smokehouse with its still-burning fire, and perfectly preserved meat. When they emerged back in Dmitri's cabin, Abram sat at the small table. He didn't apologize for his previous mockery. He didn't say he had been wrong, but he asked detailed questions. How deep did you dig? What spacing for the support frames? How did you manage ventilation? Where did you source the timber? Dmitri answered. Each question, he explained the principles he had learned in the Ural mines. He described the labor process, the timeline, the challenges he had encountered. Abram listened, occasionally nodding. Finally, he asked if Dmitri would help him design a similar system. Over the next week, other neighbors visited. Mikhail Orlov had lost half his meat supply. His smokehouse fire had died on January 29th. Henrik Korhonen had attempted to reach his smokehouse during the worst cold and suffered severe frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand. He would likely lose those fingers. His meat was also ruined. The pattern was consistent across the scattered settlement. Everyone had faced the same crisis. Distance from cabin to smokehouse became an impossible barrier during the extreme cold. Those who attempted the journey risked death or injury. Those who stayed inside lost their food supplies. Only Dmitri had maintained his meat stores perfectly. His tunnel had allowed continuous access, regardless of surface conditions. Spring 1865 arrived slowly. By late April, the ground had thawed enough for excavation work. Mikhail Orlov was the first to begin digging. He had spent the winter months planning his tunnel system, consulting with Dmitri on design details and structural requirements. Mikhail's smokehouse was 40 yards from his cabin, 10 yards farther than Dmitri's had been. This meant more excavation, more support framing, more labor. But Mikhail had witnessed the alternative. His family had nearly starved in late winter after losing most of their meat supply. The tunnel represented insurance he could no longer afford to be without. Dmitri helped with the surveying and initial excavation. He showed Mikhail how to construct the support frames, how to space them properly, how to line the tunnel walls with boards to hold back earth. Mikhail's two oldest sons, aged 14 and 16, provided labor. The three of them worked through May and June, making steady progress. By July, two more families had begun tunnel projects. Henrik Korhonen started excavating despite his injured hand. He had lost two fingers to frostbite, and the remaining fingers had limited mobility. But he worked slowly and carefully, determined to complete a tunnel before the next winter. Abram Lebedev began his excavation in early July after finishing his spring planting. The tunnel construction techniques spread through demonstration rather than explanation. Neighbors visited active excavation sites, observed the methods being used, and adapted them to their own situations. Dmitry found himself serving as an informal consultant, answering questions about depth, support requirements, and ventilation systems. Each family's tunnel reflected their specific circumstances. Mikhail's tunnel was longer than Dmitry's, requiring additional support frames. Henrik built a narrower tunnel to reduce excavation volume, compensating for his limited hand function. Abram created a larger root cellar chamber, planning to store not just vegetables but also tools and supplies he wanted protected from weather. The common elements remained consistent across all projects. Entrance shaft inside the cabin, horizontal tunnel at sufficient depth to avoid frost heaving, timber support frames at regular intervals, exit shaft rising into the smokehouse structure. The specific dimensions and details varied, but the fundamental engineering was the same. By autumn 1865, 5 families in the scattered settlement had completed functional tunnel systems. Several others had begun excavation but hadn't finished before cold weather stopped outdoor work. These partial tunnels would be completed the following spring. The investment in labor remained substantial. Mikhail estimated his family had invested 3 months of combined work. Henrik had spent 4 months working alone, but none of them questioned whether the effort was worthwhile. The previous winter had taught them that meat storage wasn't just about convenience. It was about survival. A tunnel that provided protected access during extreme weather was worth whatever labor it required. Winter 1865 through 1866 passed without extreme cold, comparable to the previous year. Temperatures dropped to 30 below on several occasions, cold enough to be dangerous but manageable. The settlers with completed tunnels used them regularly, appreciating the convenience even without a crisis to validate the systems. Those without tunnels continued traditional methods, making cautious trips to their smokehouses during cold spells. But the memory of 58 below zero remained vivid. Families that had started tunnel excavations in 1865 completed them in the spring and summer of 1866. New settlers arriving in the territory heard stories about the killing cold and the tunnels that had saved Dmitry Volkov's meat supply, while others lost everything. Several new homesteaders built tunnel systems during their first year of settlement before they had even experienced a full Dakota winter. The phrase Volkov Tunnel became common terminology in the scattered Russian settlement. When someone mentioned building a Volkov Tunnel, everyone understood the reference. The term spread to other immigrant communities in the territory. Finnish settlers used the technique. A group of Norwegian families establishing homesteads 30 miles north heard about the method and adopted it. German settlers near the Missouri River built variations using stone instead of timber for the support structures. The tunnels evolved beyond simple smokehouse access. Some families extended their systems to include storage for tools, grain, and other supplies. A few ambitious homesteaders created multiple chambers off the main tunnel, essentially building underground annexes to their cabins. The stable temperature made these spaces ideal for any storage that needed protection from extreme heat or cold. Winter 1868 through 1869 brought another severe cold snap, though not as extreme as 1865. Temperatures dropped to 46 below zero and remained there for 5 days. This time, families with tunnel systems continued their normal routines. Those without tunnels faced the familiar crisis of inaccessible smokehouses and dying fires. The validation was complete. The tunnels weren't just theoretical protection against rare events, they were practical infrastructure that improved winter survival under various conditions. The labor investment during construction was significant, but the long-term benefit justified the effort. Dimitri's original tunnel remained in use without major repairs. The timber support frames showed no signs of rot or weakness. The earthen walls, held back by wooden boards, remained stable. The system required minimal maintenance beyond occasionally replacing boards that showed moisture damage or reinforcing sections where minor settling had occurred. By 1870, tunnel construction had become standard practice for serious homesteaders in the northern Dakota Territory. New arrivals building their first cabins often included tunnel excavation in their initial construction plans. The technique was no longer viewed as unusual or excessive. It was simply how you built a homestead if you intended to survive long-term in a harsh climate. The spread extended beyond the Russian immigrant community. American settlers, Swedish families, and mixed heritage homesteaders all adopted variations of the method. The engineering principles Dimitri had brought from the Ural mines had become frontier standard practice across hundreds of square miles of territory. Dmitri Volkov continued living on his Dakota homestead through the 1870s and into the 1880s. He never married, never sought recognition for his tunnel innovation, and never attempted to profit from the technique that bore his name. He lived quietly, trapping and hunting in early years, then transitioning to small-scale farming as he aged and the frontier became more settled. Visitors occasionally arrived asking to see the original Volkov tunnel. Dmitri showed them the system, answered questions about construction methods, and shared his knowledge freely. He viewed the tunnel as a solution to a specific problem, not as an invention worthy of special attention. The fact that others had adopted the method pleased him primarily because it meant fewer families would face the crisis that had killed Pyotr Sokolov. The tunnel itself aged well. By the late 1870s, it had been in continuous use for over 15 years. The timber support frames remained solid. Dmitri replaced a few boards where moisture had caused deterioration, but the overall structure needed remarkably little maintenance. The principle of underground stability that he had learned in the mines proved accurate. Protected from weather and temperature extremes, the wooden infrastructure lasted far longer than surface structures. In 1883, Dmitri sold his homestead to a Norwegian family newly arrived in the territory. They were specifically seeking a property with an established tunnel system, having heard about the method from other settlers. The tunnel was mentioned in the sale agreement as a valuable feature of the property, comparable to the cabin and outbuildings. Dmitri moved to a small town in Montana Territory where several former Dakota settlers had relocated. He worked occasionally as a laborer, but was essentially retired. He lived in a boarding house, spent his evenings playing cards with other old frontiersmen, and rarely spoke about his past. In 1888, a journalist writing about frontier innovations visited the Dakota settlement researching construction techniques used by early homesteaders. He interviewed multiple families who had built tunnel systems and eventually tracked down Dmitri in Montana. The journalist wanted to write a story celebrating Dmitri's invention. Dmitri declined to participate. He suggested the journalist talk to the families actually using the tunnels rather than focusing on one man who had simply adapted mining techniques to a different application. The journalist wrote his article anyway, but it focused more on the collective adoption of the method rather than Dmitri as an individual inventor. A few small newspapers published versions of the story. It generated no particular attention. Frontier construction techniques were not topics that captured public imagination in the late 1880s. Dmitri Volkov died in March 1891 at age 60. He was buried in a small cemetery outside the Montana town where he had spent his final years. A few former neighbors from Dakota attended the funeral. His gravestone listed his name, birth and death years, and nothing else. But in the Dakota Territory, now approaching statehood, dozens of homesteads still used tunnel systems based on his original design. New construction continued to incorporate the method. The tunnels remained functional, connecting cabins to smokehouses, providing protected access during brutal winters, maintaining stable storage temperatures, and occasionally saving lives when extreme weather made surface travel impossible. The engineering principle Dmitri had brought from Russian silver mines had become permanent frontier architecture. His name attached to the method gradually faded as the technique became standard practice. Eventually, new settlers built tunnels without knowing who had first demonstrated the method or why it was called a Volkov tunnel. But the structures themselves endured, silent testimony to what careful engineering and determined labor could accomplish on the American frontier.